When a man on a crowded flight mocked the fake humility of Hollywood stars, he had no idea the quiet stranger beside him was Keanu Reeves. But when the plane hit terrifying turbulence, everything changed, and what Keanu did next would silence every passenger on board, including the man who insulted him. The terminal was loud with a rhythm of rolling suitcases and murmured conversations, but Keanu Reeves moved through it quietly, blending in as if he were any other traveler. He wore a simple black hoodie, jeans, and an old backpack that had clearly seen years of travel. There was no entourage, no bodyguard, no press. Just a man walking toward his gate, content with anonymity. The boarding sign flashed, Toronto to Los Angeles, and passengers began to line up in their zones. When the gate attendant saw his ticket, her eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, almost whispering. "We can upgrade you to first class if you'd like. Complimentary, of course." Keanu smiled gently, the kind of smile that was both kind and final. "Thank you, but I'll stay where I'm seated," he said. "It's fine. I prefer sitting with everyone else." The woman blinked, clearly not used to that answer. Most celebrities would have accepted without hesitation. "Are you sure?" she asked again. He nodded once, already turning to head down the boarding tunnel. Completely sure. Inside the plane, the narrow aisle was crowded with passengers tucking their bags into the overhead bins. Some glanced up, doing a double take as they recognized him. A few whispered, but Keanu simply smiled politely and moved toward his row. Seat 22 amperes window seat. Economy class. The man in 22B was already sitting down, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit and checking the shine on his gold watch. His name was Greg Whitman, and everything about him screamed self-importance. The way he leaned back, the way he sighed loudly whenever someone brushed past him, even the way he looked at the flight attendants like he was doing them a favor by being there. When Keanu reached the seat, Greg looked up briefly. His eyes flicked from Keanu's face to his clothes, then to the backpack. "You sure you're in the right seat, buddy?" he asked, his tone half joking but edged with judgment. Keanu offered his boarding pass with an easy nod. "Yeah, this is me, 22 amperes." Greg checked the ticket, his mouth curling into a smirk. "Didn't expect movie stars to fly coach," he said. Keanu slid into his seat by the window, his movements quiet, unbothered. "Sometimes it's nice to stay grounded," he said softly. Greg chuckled at that, shaking his head. "Right, sure, grounded." He looked around at the other passengers and said a bit louder, "Guess some folks just want attention." No one responded, though a few people shifted uncomfortably. Keanu said nothing. He pulled a small book from his backpack, The Art of Stillness, and began to read. Greg, still restless, tapped his watch and muttered something about the delay. When the plane door finally closed and the engine began to hum, he leaned toward Keanu again. "So, you travel a lot?" "A fair amount," Keanu replied politely without looking up from his page. Greg grinned, clearly fishing for conversation or perhaps for a reaction. "Business or pleasure?" "Life," Keanu said simply. Greg laughed loudly, as if he'd just heard the world's driest joke. "Right. Okay, Mr. Life. Hope you don't snore." The engines roared louder. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts. Keanu looked out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, the runway lights glowing like faint stars. The plane began to roll forward. As it lifted off, Greg leaned over again, smirking. "You know, you kind of look like that Matrix guy. What's his name? Reeves or something." Keanu turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "I get that. Sometimes," he said. Greg laughed again, too loud for the small space. "Yeah, right, like he'd ever sit back here with the rest of us." Keanu turned back to the window. The reflection of his calm face floated in the glass, framed by the orange glow of dawn. The engines roared beneath them as the plane climbed higher, and in that moment, the quiet man by the window seemed entirely at peace, while the man beside him had no idea he was sitting next to the real thing. The plane leveled out smoothly, cutting through the thin layer of clouds above Toronto. The seatbelt light flicked off with a soft chime, and a wave of motion filled the cabin passengers, stretching, adjusting, and settling in for the long flight. Greg Whitman loosened his tie and sighed heavily, the kind of exaggerated sound meant to remind everyone around him that he was important, busy, and tired of waiting. He turned to Keanu again, trying to strike up another conversation. "So, what do you do, friend? You don't exactly look like the business type." Keanu looked up from his book, his voice calm. "I work in film." Greg's eyebrows rose. "Film? Huh? Like, behind the camera?" Keanu nodded slightly, offering no further detail. "Sometimes," Greg smirked. "Interesting. I'm in finance myself. I build real things. Companies, investments, portfolios. Film's all imagination, you know? Pretend. I could never get into that Hollywood stuff." Keanu smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting. "That's fair. Everyone's got their path." Greg took that as an invitation to brag. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "Yeah, I fly all the time. London, New York, Dubai, you name it. Usually first class, but this trip was last minute, so here I am with the regular folks." He gave a small chuckle and gestured around the cabin. "No offense." Keanu didn't respond. He turned a page in his book, his calmness amplifying Greg's need to fill the silence. Across the aisle, a mother tried to quiet her toddler, who was fussing about a dropped toy. Without hesitation, Keanu set down his book, leaned forward, and reached under the seats to retrieve it. He handed it back with a gentle smile. "Thank you," the woman said softly. The child giggled, clutching the toy. Greg watched the exchange and rolled his eyes. "You really don't need to play hero. They have flight attendants for that," he muttered under his breath. Keanu heard him but said nothing. He simply returned to his seat, calm as ever. The lack of reaction seemed to irritate Greg more than any argument could have. A flight attendant named Marissa came by with the drink cart. "Can I offer you something to drink?" she asked politely. Greg straightened. "Whiskey, top shelf, if you've got it." Marissa smiled professionally. "We only serve a standard brand in economy, sir." Greg sighed. "Figures." He turned to Keanu. "And you?" "Just water, please," Keanu said quietly. As Marissa handed it over, she looked closer at him, her eyes lighting up in recognition. She didn't say a word, but her smile said everything. Greg noticed and raised an eyebrow. "You know him?" he asked. Marissa hesitated. "Everyone does," she replied simply. Greg frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She smiled again, professional and kind. "You'll see." Greg turned toward Keanu, trying to read his face. But Keanu had already gone back to his book, the soft hum of the engines filling the silence between them. For the next half hour, the cabin grew quieter as passengers settled into the rhythm of the flight. The hum of the engines became a kind of lullaby. A few people had noticed Keanu by now, whispering quietly but keeping their distance out of respect. He didn't wear sunglasses or a hat, didn't try to hide. Yet there was something about his calm presence that made others instinctively lower their voices around him. Greg, however, couldn't stay quiet for long. "You know what I don't get?" he said suddenly, glancing at Keanu. "All these celebrities pretending to be humble, flying coach just to look relatable. Meanwhile, they've got mansions and private jets waiting for them." Keanu looked up from his book. "Maybe some people just prefer simple things," he said gently. Greg chuckled and leaned back. "Sure, and maybe I'm the Pope." He laughed at his own joke, but no one else did. A few nearby passengers gave him quick, disapproving looks. Keanu remained still, hands folded over the book in his lap. Greg stared at him for a moment longer. "You're not gonna argue? Not even a little?" "No reason to," Keanu said. "We're just two people sharing a flight." The simplicity of the response disarmed Greg for a moment. He fidgeted with his watch, checking the time, clearly uncomfortable with the silence that followed. The truth was, he'd spent most of his life talking over people, trying to prove his worth. But beside this quiet man, his words seemed to echo and fall flat. A few minutes later, the flight attendants came through the aisle again, offering snacks. Keanu declined politely, while Greg grabbed a bag of pretzels and tore it open carelessly, crumbs scattering onto his lap. He noticed a couple across the aisle smiling at Keanu, whispering something. "I swear," Greg muttered, "people treat actors like saints." Keanu looked at him, his expression soft but firm. "Sometimes it's not about who they are. It's about what they do when no one's watching." Greg raised an eyebrow. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "Just an observation," Keanu said, returning his gaze to the window. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the clouds in bands of orange and gold. The light caught Keanu's reflection in the glass, calm and untroubled. Greg turned away, feeling something unfamiliar, a mix of irritation and shame. As the plane climbed higher into the fading light, Greg leaned toward him one last time. "You really do look like that Matrix guy," he said, smirking. "But he'd never sit back here." Keanu gave a quiet laugh, barely audible over the hum of the engines. "Maybe you don't know him as well as you think." Greg chuckled, shaking his head, completely unaware of who sat beside him. The engines roared softly beneath their feet. The clouds stretched endlessly ahead, and the story of humility and arrogance was only just beginning. The flight settled into its long, steady rhythm. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as sunlight streamed through the windows, washing the rows of passengers in warm gold. Somewhere near the back, a baby giggled. The sound blended softly with the rustling of snack wrappers and the faint clatter of ice in plastic cups. Greg Whitman, however, seemed immune to calm. He leaned into the aisle, speaking loudly enough for everyone within 2 rows to hear. "You know, I closed a major deal in Dubai last week," he announced. 7 figures. I barely slept for 3 days. That's what real success looks like. It doesn't fit in economy class, that's for sure. Keanu, sitting beside him, turned a page in his small book, The Art of Stillness, and nodded faintly. His expression carried no irritation, only quiet acknowledgement. Greg mistook that silence for admiration. "You have no idea how brutal the markets are," he continued. "It's survival of the fittest. I built my business from the ground up. No handouts, no Hollywood dreams, just hard numbers and smart moves." Keanu looked up for a moment. "That sounds like a lot of pressure," he said. Greg scoffed. "Pressure is what makes diamonds, my friend." Keanu smiled softly and returned to his reading. Across the aisle, a young mother struggled with her restless toddler. The little boy dropped his toy car, which rolled under Greg's seat. Without a word, Keanu set his book aside and reached down to pick it up, handing it back to the mother with a gentle smile. The woman exhaled in relief. "Thank you so much," she said quietly. The child grinned at Keanu, showing a missing front tooth. "Thank you, mister." Keanu gave a small nod. "You're welcome, buddy." Greg rolled his eyes, muttering, "What's next? Diaper duty?" He said it under his breath, but just loud enough for Keanu to hear. Keanu's expression didn't change. He simply leaned back in his seat, folding his hands loosely in his lap. The stillness around him seemed to bother Greg more than any argument could have. Passengers nearby began to notice. A woman a few rows up whispered to her husband, "He's so patient. Imagine sitting next to that guy for hours." Her husband replied softly, "He's handling it better than I would." Marissa, the flight attendant, appeared again with the beverage cart. Her eyes caught Keanu's calm expression, and she smiled knowingly. "Drinks, gentlemen?" she asked. Greg straightened up immediately, eager to reassert control. "Whiskey?" he said. "Top shelf if you have it," Marissa offered an apologetic smile. "I'm afraid we only have the standard brand, sir." Greg waved dismissively. "Fine, make it a double." "And for you?" she asked, turning to Keanu. "Just water, please," he said, his tone gentle. She poured it carefully, glancing at him again as recognition dawned quietly in her eyes. Marissa set the small cup of water on Keanu's tray, her smile polite but meaningful. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she said softly. There was a subtle warmth in her tone, the kind reserved for people she genuinely admired. She didn't announce his name or call attention to him. She simply offered kindness, and Keanu returned it with a nod of gratitude. Greg noticed immediately. His sharp eyes darted between them, suspicion flickering in his expression. "You know him or something?" he asked. Marissa hesitated, just long enough to make him curious. "Everyone does," she replied quietly, her smile never leaving her face. Then she moved down the aisle, offering drinks to other passengers. Greg raised an eyebrow. "Everyone does," he repeated mockingly. "That's rich. Who are you, some motivational speaker?" Keanu took a sip of his water before answering. "No, just someone who likes quiet flights." Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "Right. Must be nice, living off imagination. Pretend for a living, huh?" He took a sip of his whiskey, grimaced, and muttered, "Not top shelf. Figures." Keanu rested his cup on the tray and looked out the window. The sky was streaked with soft pink and gold, the clouds below like vast fields of cotton. For a brief moment, his face was illuminated by the setting sun, calm and contemplative. Greg leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You see, the problem with people like you, actors, celebrities, whatever, is that you don't know what real work is. You get paid to fake emotions. Meanwhile, people like me build things that actually matter." Keanu turned back to him slowly, his voice still steady. "I think there are many kinds of work that matter," Greg snorted. "Please, don't tell me movies change the world." Keanu's gaze stayed on him for a long moment. "Sometimes they change one person," he said. "And that's enough." Greg frowned, unsure how to respond. He expected arrogance or defensiveness, but he got neither. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. He looked away, tapping his empty cup against the tray to break the tension. Across the aisle, the little boy peeked over the seat and waved at Keanu again. "Mister, look," he said, holding up his toy car. Keanu smiled and gave a small thumbs up. The child giggled, and the mother mouthed a quiet thank you once more. Greg sighed loudly. "Man, people eat that stuff up, don't they?" Keanu didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back and picked up his book again, his calmness like a wall Greg couldn't climb. Greg turned toward the aisle, muttering, "I swear, people these days worship fake heroes." Marissa passed by again, refilling cups, her eyes flicking toward Keanu in gratitude. He caught her glance and offered a small smile. She nodded subtly before walking away, leaving Greg to stew in his own restless pride. The flight continued smoothly, but the tension between the two men lingered in the air like static before a storm. The minutes turned into hours, and the rhythm of the flight became a quiet symphony of engines, footsteps, and muted conversation. Most passengers had settled into sleep or distraction, but Greg still fidgeted in his seat, unable to rest. His restless energy seemed to clash with Keanu's calm stillness. At one point, Greg glanced at Keanu's book and chuckled. "The Art of Stillness," he read aloud. "That's what you're reading? You're kidding me. What's that even about doing nothing?" Keanu closed the book gently, marking his page with a napkin. "It's about learning peace when the world gets loud," Greg scoffed. "Peace doesn't build companies. You can't sit still when you're chasing success." Keanu turned slightly toward him. "Maybe success isn't always about chasing," Greg laughed sharply. "You sound like one of those self-help guys on podcasts. Let me tell you, life isn't poetry, it's a fight." Keanu nodded, still unruffled. "You might be right, but even fighters need rest." Greg stared at him, frustrated by his calm replies, as though he couldn't find a single crack in the man's serenity. It made him uneasy, like arguing with a mirror that refused to reflect anger. The cabin lights dimmed for evening. A faint orange glow lingered along the horizon, stretching across the clouds. Keanu reached for the window shade but stopped halfway, leaving it open enough for the light to wash his face. His expression was peaceful, reflective. Greg leaned his head back, closing his eyes, but his thoughts wouldn't quiet. He kept replaying Marissa's words. Everyone does. Everyone knew this man beside him, and yet he seemed indifferent to the attention. No first-class seat, no entourage, no arrogance, just quiet kindness. It bothered Greg in a way he didn't understand. When the drink cart came again, Greg ordered another whiskey. Marissa hesitated, glancing at the half-empty cup still on his tray. "Of course, sir," she said diplomatically. She poured it, but her attention shifted briefly to Keanu. "Another water, Mr. Reeves?" Greg froze mid-sip. The name hit him like turbulence. Keanu smiled softly. "No, thank you, Marissa." She moved on. Greg turned to stare, his mind spinning. "Reeves," he repeated quietly. "Wait a second, Keanu Reeves?" Keanu didn't confirm it. He simply gave a gentle nod, his eyes still on the glowing horizon. Greg sat back slowly, realization sinking in. The man he had mocked for hours, the man he called fake and lazy, was one of the most respected actors alive, and he had said nothing, not a word, in defense. Outside, the last light of day faded into darkness. Inside, Greg was left in a silence he didn't quite know how to sit with. The cabin had fallen into that calm rhythm of long flights, dimmed lights, the low hum of engines, and the soft shuffle of people adjusting in their seats. Most passengers were either asleep or lost in movies, their trays cleared, and the scent of brewed coffee lingering faintly in the air. Greg Whitman had finally stopped talking. He was dozing lightly, his chin resting on his chest. Keanu Reeves sat quietly, still awake, reading in the faint glow of his overhead light. He had always preferred the quiet hours in the sky, when the world outside the window seemed infinite and the clouds looked like waves frozen in motion. Everything felt peaceful, suspended. Then it happened. A sharp jolt, the kind that ripped passengers out of comfort and into fear. The plane dropped slightly, rattling like a shaken toy. Gasps erupted across the cabin. Someone screamed. Greg's eyes shot open. "What the?" he muttered, gripping his armrest as the lights flickered overhead. Another violent shake followed. The overhead bins rattled, a loose latch clattering above. A baby began to cry. The captain's voice crackled over the speaker, his tone calm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. We're encountering a pocket of unexpected turbulence." Greg's composure shattered instantly. "This can't be happening," he muttered, panic rising in his voice. "We're gonna crash. I knew it." Keanu calmly removed his headphones, setting them aside. "We're not crashing," he said softly. His tone carried no fear, only quiet control. He looked across the aisle and saw the young mother holding her toddler tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. "Hey," Keanu said gently, leaning forward slightly. "It's okay. Just a rough patch. It'll pass." The child was crying uncontrollably, clutching the stuffed toy Keanu had helped retrieve earlier. He smiled at the boy. "You're brave, right? Like a superhero." The boy sniffled and nodded, faintly. "Yeah." The plane lurched again, harder this time. Luggage shifted in the overhead bins. A loud thud sounded from a few rows back as someone's bag fell onto the aisle. Marissa, the flight attendant, hurried past, trying to calm passengers, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. Keanu stood slightly, bracing himself on the seats. "Do you need help?" he asked. She nodded quickly, eyes wide. "Yes, please just keep everyone calm while I check the back." Greg was breathing hard now, gripping the armrest so tight his knuckles turned white. "We're going down," he muttered. "We're going down." Keanu placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Look at me," he said evenly. "Take a breath. We're fine." Greg met his eyes, and for the first time, saw no trace of panic there. Just steady, grounded, calm, the kind that anchored everyone else when the world tilted out of control. The plane shuddered again, the engines humming louder, but Keanu didn't flinch. Around him, the panic began to slow, replaced by a tentative stillness. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane dipped again, sending a ripple of gasps through the rows. The sound of rattling compartments and clinking glasses echoed above the anxious whispers. A flight attendant stumbled, catching herself on the seatbacks. Someone yelled from the back, "What's happening?" Keanu stood halfway in the aisle, gripping the top of a seat for balance. "It's all right," he said, his voice low and steady. "Stay seated and keep your belts on." His calm tone carried further than he realized, weaving through the fear like a thread of reason. Greg's breathing was shallow and rapid. Sweat glistened on his forehead. "How are you so calm?" he demanded. "Do Do you not get it? We're in the middle of nowhere at 30,000 feet. Keanu crouched slightly beside him, speaking evenly. Panicking won't help. We breathe. We wait. It'll pass. Greg shook his head, gripping the armrest tighter. You don't know that. I do, Keanu replied, because fear doesn't change the outcome. Calm does. A loud metallic clunk echoed overhead. One of the bins above them had come loose. A heavy carry-on bag slipped out, tumbling forward in slow motion. Passengers gasped as it plummeted toward an elderly woman sitting by the aisle. Without hesitation, Keanu stepped forward, reaching out with both hands. The bag landed squarely into his grasp, inches from the woman's face. The cabin fell silent for a second. Keanu lowered the bag gently to the floor and looked at the woman. You okay, ma'am? She nodded, eyes wide. Thank you, she whispered. Marissa appeared moments later, holding on to the overhead compartment to steady herself. Mr. Reeves, thank you, she said breathlessly. Just doing what I can, Keanu replied. The turbulence continued, but now there was something different in the air. Fear hadn't vanished, but it was quieter, restrained by the steady rhythm of one man's calm voice. Keanu moved down the aisle, helping passengers adjust their seatbelts and secure bags. Every time the plane shook, he spoke softly. You're safe. It's just wind. Greg watched in disbelief. The man he'd mocked for hours, called fake, lazy, and out of touch, was now the one holding the entire cabin together. After several tense minutes, the plane steadied. The rumble softened, the overhead lights flickered back to full brightness, and the captain's voice came through again. Ladies and gentlemen, we've passed through the turbulence. Thank you for your patience. A collective exhale filled the air. Someone in the back clapped softly, followed by others. Marissa wiped her forehead with a small napkin and turned to Keanu, whispering, You kept them calm, better than we could have. Keanu smiled humbly. You did your job. I just helped. Greg sat in stunned silence, his earlier arrogance melting away with every passing second. For the first time since takeoff, he had nothing to say. As the plane leveled out, a cautious quiet filled the cabin. Passengers looked around, exchanging tired but relieved smiles. The air still buzzed faintly with adrenaline, but the danger had passed. Keanu stood near the aisle, steadying himself against the seatbacks as he checked on the people around him. The elderly woman he'd helped gave him a trembling smile, and he nodded gently in return. Greg sat rigid in his seat, his shirt damp with sweat, breathing unevenly. He couldn't bring himself to look up. The same man he'd spent hours belittling had just helped save someone from injury, and somehow he'd done it without fear. Marissa came by, crouching beside Keanu as she steadied a tray of fallen cups. You really do know how to handle a crisis, she said quietly. Keanu smiled. Not my first bumpy flight. She looked up at him with a mix of awe and gratitude. You don't realize how much you helped back there. People listened to you. You made them feel safe. He shook his head modestly. People calm each other. I just reminded them how. Behind him, Greg exhaled shakily. You caught that bag, he said, his voice unsteady. I mean, you just grabbed it, like it was nothing. Keanu sat back down, adjusting his seatbelt. Reflexes, he said simply. And a little luck. Greg let out a shaky laugh, rubbing his forehead. Man, I thought that was it. I really did. You didn't even flinch. Keanu glanced at him, his tone kind. I've been through worse. It helps to stay present. Greg frowned slightly, still processing. You didn't even look scared. Keanu's eyes turned toward the window. Fear's natural, he said softly. But panic spreads faster than wind. Someone's got to stay grounded. Greg nodded slowly, his mind turning over the words. For the first time, there was no sarcasm, no judgment, just humility. Across the aisle, the young mother reached over. Thank you, she said sincerely. My little boy stopped crying when you talked to him. I think you made him believe everything would be okay. Keanu smiled at the child, who now sat clutching his stuffed toy, eyes red, but calm. He already believed it, Keanu said. He just needed to hear it out loud. Marissa passed again, straightening a few seats and glancing at him. "Thank you again, Mr. Reeves." Keanu gave a small nod, his voice barely above a whisper. "Anytime." The hum of the engines returned to its steady rhythm. The worst had passed, but something in the cabin had shifted. The people on that flight would remember the quiet man in seat 22 amperes, not for his fame, but for the calm he brought when the world above the clouds had started to shake. The turbulence had passed, but its shadow lingered in the air. The cabin was quiet now, unnaturally quiet, broken only by the faint hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of someone adjusting their seatbelt. Passengers were still catching their breath, staring blankly ahead as if afraid another jolt might come. Greg Whitman sat rigid, his posture slouched for once. His face had lost its confident color, and his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup to take a sip of the watered-down whiskey. The arrogant shine that had once defined him seemed to fade under the dull overhead lights. Across the aisle, Keanu Reeves leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, arms resting loosely on the armrests. His calm presence radiated something grounding, like quiet after a storm. The passengers nearest to him seemed to mirror that composure, breathing slower, shoulders relaxing, the tension slowly melting away. Marissa walked down the aisle, checking on each passenger with practiced professionalism. When she reached row 22, she paused, her expression softening. "You handled that like a pro," she said quietly. Keanu opened his eyes and smiled faintly. "I've had worse rides on movie sets," he said. Marissa let out a small, shaky laugh, the sound breaking the tension around them. "Well, if you ever get tired of acting, we could use people like you up here." He smiled again, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I think I'll stick to pretending for now. You're the real heroes up here." She shook her head lightly, touched by his humility. "You've got no idea how much you helped. Everyone was looking at you. You kept them calm." Keanu gave a slight nod. "Sometimes people just need someone to look at who's not afraid." A teenage boy in the seat behind Greg leaned forward, his voice hushed but excited. "Hey, excuse me, sir. Are you really Keanu Reeves?" Keanu turned slightly, smiling in that quiet, familiar way that made people feel seen. "Just Keanu's fine," he said. The boy grinned wide, whispering something to his mother, who smiled too, mouthing a silent thank you across the aisle. Keanu returned the gesture with a small wave before leaning back again. Greg watched the interaction from the corner of his eye. His mind replayed the last 20 minutes. His panic, his shouting, the way he'd frozen when the turbulence hit. He remembered Keanu's steady hand on his shoulder, his calm voice saying, "Take a breath. We're fine." For the first time in a long while, Greg had nothing to prove. No comeback, no smug remark. Just a quiet, humbling realization that maybe strength wasn't about power or status, but control. Control over yourself when everything around you was chaos. He looked down at his trembling hand and tightened it into a fist, not out of anger, but out of something close to shame. Greg stayed silent as Marissa moved on to check the next row. The clinking of plastic cups and the low murmur of relieved voices filled the cabin, slowly bringing it back to life. People were beginning to smile again, sharing small words of gratitude with one another. The worst had passed, but no one would forget how it had felt when the plane had dropped through the air and their hearts had gone with it. Keanu leaned his head against the seat, eyes half closed, letting the calm return. The young mother across the aisle whispered softly to her son, who now rested his head on her shoulder. "See, I told you everything would be fine," she said. The boy peeked over at Keanu again, his small face still marked by awe. Marissa came by once more. This time, without the hurried pace of crisis, she crouched beside Keanu's seat, speaking quietly. "I just wanted to say thank you again," she said. "You didn't hesitate for a second back there." Keanu looked at her, his tone light. "You did all the work. I just helped a little." Marissa smiled. "A little? You calmed half the cabin. You should have seen the captain's face when I told him who you were." Keanu chuckled softly. "I'm guessing he didn't believe it at first." "Not until I told him you were catching bags mid-air," she said, laughing quietly now. The moment drew a few smiles from the nearby passengers who overheard. The tension in the cabin seemed to dissolve completely, like fog lifting after a storm. Behind them, Greg listened, feeling smaller with every passing second. He remembered the way he'd mocked this man, how he'd called him fake and useless, how he'd treated kindness as weakness. Now, hearing others speak about Keanu with admiration, all he could think about was how wrong he'd been. He picked up his whiskey again, but his hand trembled too much to take a proper sip. Instead, he set it down, staring into the melting ice. Keanu glanced toward him briefly, reading his unease but saying nothing. The silence between them wasn't awkward, now it was human. From the back of the cabin, someone started clapping. It was a hesitant sound at first, a single pair of hands applauding softly. Then another joined, and another, until the sound rolled forward through the rows like a wave of gratitude. Marissa froze mid-step, her hand over her chest. The passengers were clapping for the crew, for the flight attendants, for the calm that had returned. Keanu turned in his seat and smiled toward the back, giving a small thumbs up to Marissa. She blinked quickly, trying not to cry. "You're something else, you know that?" she whispered. Keanu shrugged, his eyes warm. "Just happy we're all still flying." The applause faded into a comfortable quiet. Above them, the engines hummed steadily, carrying the plane onward through smooth, open skies. The calm that followed felt deeper than before, as if the whole cabin was exhaling at once. A few passengers began to talk quietly again, voices gentle and measured. The fear that had once filled the air was replaced by something else, a shared gratitude, an unspoken connection among strangers who had just faced the same moment of uncertainty together. Greg leaned back in his seat, his heartbeat finally slowing to something close to normal. He stared out the small oval window beside him, watching the endless sweep of clouds stretching across the horizon. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about numbers, deals, or deadlines. He was just thinking about breath, about how fragile it felt, and how good it was to still have it. Beside him, Keanu rested with his arms folded loosely, eyes closed once again. He looked completely at peace. Even in the soft glow of the cabin lights, there was something grounding about him, something that reminded people of still water, steady, reflective, unshaken. Greg's gaze lingered on him. His mind replayed every word he'd said earlier, every arrogant jab, every careless comment. Shame burned quietly in his chest. He'd judged this man before knowing him, before understanding what real composure looked like. The teenage boy behind them leaned forward again, still full of wonder. "Mom," he whispered, "he's really him. The guy from The Matrix. He caught that bag like it was part of the movie." The mother smiled. "He's even calmer in real life," she whispered back. Keanu opened his eyes just slightly, catching the exchange. He turned his head and smiled at the boy. "Glad you're okay, kid." The boy grinned shyly, nodding. "You're awesome," Keanu chuckled softly. "No, you were brave. You helped your mom stay calm." The boy sat back proudly, and the passengers around them smiled. The tension had lifted completely now. Even those who hadn't recognized Keanu before seemed to sense something special about him, something far beyond fame. Greg picked up his drink again, but this time it wasn't to mask anything. He lifted it slightly toward Keanu, an unspoken gesture of acknowledgement. Keanu caught it out of the corner of his eye and returned a small nod, accepting the silent truce. Marissa walked past once more, pausing just long enough to glance at Keanu. "Everything good here?" "Better than good," he said softly. As she moved on, Greg took a slow breath, letting the weight of the past few hours settle. For once, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. The sound of the engines was enough. The storm had passed, not just in the sky, but inside him. The hum of the engines had become almost hypnotic. The cabin lights were dimmed again, and most passengers had drifted into quiet conversation or light sleep. The air felt calmer now, softer, as though the turbulence had washed something away, not just fear, but pride and pretense. Greg sat with his hands clasped, his untouched drink resting on the tray before him. He had been silent for nearly an hour, his thoughts tangled and heavy. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked toward Keanu, who sat calmly reading again. His posture relaxed, his breathing steady. Finally, Greg spoke, his voice low, almost uncertain. "You really are him, aren't you?" Keanu looked up from his book, a small smile crossing his face. "Last I checked," he said softly. Greg laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess I was wrong about you." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "About what?" "About everything," Greg said, letting out a long sigh. "About fame. About what it means to be successful. About people like you." He looked down at his hands. "You didn't even flinch up there." "I lost it. I panicked like a kid." Keanu shrugged gently. "Everyone gets scared sometimes. It's human." Greg shook his head. "Yeah, but not like that. You didn't just stay calm. You made everyone else calm. Even me. How do you do that?" Keanu leaned back, his tone thoughtful. "Maybe I've had enough chaos in life to know that fear doesn't fix anything. You just breathe through it. The trick is to stay kind even when you are scared." Greg, let those words sink in. He stared out the window for a long time, watching the faint reflection of the clouds illuminated by the moonlight. After a moment, he sighed again, this time deeper. "You know, I haven't been kind. Not to people around me. Not even to myself." Keanu said nothing, waiting. "My company's falling apart," Greg continued. "I've been pretending everything's fine, to my employees, my investors, even my wife. But it's not. I'm barely holding it together. And instead of admitting that, I keep acting like I've got it all under control. Like I'm better than everyone else." His voice cracked slightly. "Guess it's easier to play that part than to face the truth." Keanu's eyes softened. "You're not alone in that," he said. "We all wear masks sometimes, even the people who look like they've got it figured out." Greg nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "I used to think success was about power, but maybe it's just peace. The kind of peace you seem to carry everywhere you go." Keanu smiled faintly, glancing toward the window where faint lightning flickered far off in the distance, painting his calm face in flashes of silver. "Peace isn't something you find out there," he said quietly. "It's something you grow inside, piece by piece." Greg sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside the small oval window. Each flicker of lightning lit his reflection for a brief moment, a man who suddenly looked older, smaller, and more honest than he had in years. The hum of the engines filled the pauses between his thoughts. Finally, he turned toward Keanu again. "You make it sound simple," Greg said quietly. "But it's not. I've built my whole life on appearances. The house, the car, the image. I worked hard for all of it, but somehow, it's all starting to feel empty. Like I've been running a race I don't even remember signing up for." Keanu nodded slowly. "I think a lot of people feel that way," he said. "You climb, and then one day you realize you don't know why anymore." Greg gave a tired laugh. "Exactly. And when things start slipping, you just pretend harder. I've been doing that for months. My company's drowning, my marriage is hanging by a thread, and I still act like everything's perfect. It's exhausting." Keanu rested his elbows lightly on his knees. "Perfection's a heavy thing to carry. Nobody can hold it forever." Greg ran a hand through his hair, his voice softer now. "I've spent years proving I don't need anyone, that I'm self-made. But sitting here tonight, I realized I couldn't even handle a few minutes of turbulence without falling apart." He stopped, swallowing hard. "You made it look effortless." Keanu shook his head. "It wasn't effortless. It's just practice. Life throws a lot of storms your way. Some you see coming, some you don't. The trick isn't avoiding them, it's learning not to let them change who you are." Greg frowned slightly. "And who are you, really? Off the screen, I mean." Keanu's expression softened. "Someone who's still learning," he said simply. "Someone who's lost people, made mistakes, and still believes kindness matters. That's all." Greg's eyes dropped to his drink again. "Kindness. You keep saying that word like it's the secret to everything. Keanu smiled faintly. Maybe it is. Greg thought for a moment. It's funny, he said. You live in a world built on pretending movies, acting, fiction, and yet you seem more real than most people I know. Keanu met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. It's okay to be real, he said. That's what connects us. Greg felt those words land somewhere deep, quiet, and unfamiliar. He nodded slowly, his usual defenses gone. You know, he said after a long pause, when I first saw you, I thought you were just another celebrity trying to play humble. But now, he exhaled, his voice catching. Now I think I just saw someone I want to learn from. Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked out the window again, where the lightning had faded to soft flashes in the distance. We all learn from each other, he said finally. That's how we keep growing. The hum of the engines filled the space between them as Greg leaned back, letting Keanu's words settle. He had spent years surrounded by people, yet he couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him without wanting something in return. For the first time, he felt seen, not as the businessman, not as the loud voice in first class, but as a human being. He took a slow breath and said quietly, You know, I can't remember the last time I actually told someone the truth about how bad things have gotten. I keep thinking that if I just fake confidence long enough, it'll somehow fix itself. Keanu turned toward him, his expression thoughtful. Pretending can only take you so far, he said gently. Eventually, life catches up, and when it does, that's when you find out who you really are. Greg nodded, his throat tightening. Who I really am, he repeated, almost to himself. Right now, I'm a man who's lost control of everything he thought he had figured out. Maybe that's not such a bad place to start, Keanu replied softly. Greg frowned slightly. How do you mean? Keanu's voice stayed steady, carrying the quiet weight of experience. Sometimes, when everything falls apart, it gives you a chance to rebuild it the right way, without the masks, without the noise, just truth. Greg stared at him, silent, for a long moment. The man he had mocked for being fake was now the only one telling him something real. Lightning flickered again in the distance, painting Keanu's calm face in a soft silver glow. He looked serene, as though even the storm couldn't touch him. Greg rubbed his hands together, his voice low. You make it sound like peace is something anyone can have. It is, Keanu said, but it takes work, and it starts small with how we treat people, with how we treat ourselves. Greg exhaled shakily. I've been terrible at both. Then it's time to start over, Keanu said simply. There's no rule that says you can't. Greg nodded slowly, his eyes glistening faintly. I don't know why, but hearing that from you means something. Maybe it's because you don't say it like a slogan. You say it like you've lived it. Keanu gave a quiet half smile. Maybe because I have. The cabin lights flickered again, but this time the flash didn't bring fear, it brought reflection. Outside, the clouds parted slightly, revealing a stretch of calm, moonlit sky. Greg looked out through the window, his voice a whisper. It's okay to be real, he said, repeating Keanu's words. Keanu nodded, looking out at the same view. It always is. The flight had settled into a calm rhythm again. Outside the windows, the world was nothing but soft darkness, a sea of clouds stretching endlessly below. Inside, the cabin glowed in a dim amber light. People spoke in quiet voices now, their earlier fear replaced by a kind of gentle connection. It was as though everyone shared an unspoken gratitude for being there, for still flying. Marissa moved through the aisles with a stack of folded blankets draped over her arm. Her expression was tender, though she still looked tired. Blankets, anyone? She asked softly, offering warmth to the passengers who hadn't been able to rest since the turbulence. Keanu stood up without a word, taking a few from her hands. Here, let me help, he said. She hesitated for a second, surprised but grateful. You don't have to. I know, he replied, smiling. But I want to. He moved quietly from row to row, placing blankets over the shoulders of sleeping passengers and handing extras to those still awake. A man near the back smiled and whispered, "Thank you." A woman nodded in appreciation. Even the smallest gesture carried something more now, something healing. When Keanu reached the young mother across the aisle, she looked up and smiled, clearly moved. "My son hasn't stopped talking about you since he saw John Wick," she said in a hushed tone, glancing at the little boy curled against her side. Keanu chuckled softly. "That's sweet. I hope he's not scared of dogs anymore." The mother laughed quietly. "He made me buy him a stuffed one." Keanu crouched beside the boy, careful not to wake him fully. "That's a good choice," he whispered. "Dogs are good friends." The boy stirred, blinking sleepily. When he recognized Keanu's face, his eyes widened. "You're him," the boy whispered. Keanu smiled. "Maybe, but right now, I'm just a guy on a plane trying to help everyone get some rest." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pair of wired earphones, the kind worn from use. "Here," he said, handing them to the boy. "There's some music on my phone that helps me sleep. Want to try it?" The child nodded eagerly, his small hands trembling with excitement. Keanu placed one earbud gently in his ear and hit play. A soft instrumental tune filled the silence, something slow and soothing. The boy's breathing slowed, his eyelids growing heavy again. The mother covered her mouth with her hand, fighting back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu just smiled. "Sleep well." As he stood, Greg watched the exchange from his seat, his chest tightening. He had seen kindness before, but never like this. Never so quiet, so unperformed, so effortless. He looked down at the gold watch on his wrist, once a symbol of everything he'd worked for, and for the first time, it made him feel small. Greg's eyes stayed on Keanu as he moved through the rows, continuing to help Marissa with the blankets and small snack packs. Most of the passengers were either half asleep or watching quietly, their faces softened by gratitude. Keanu carried himself with a calm grace that made even the narrow airplane aisle feel like holy ground. He didn't act like someone famous. He acted like someone decent. Marissa followed a few steps behind, restocking the basket with pretzels and water bottles. She leaned close to him once, whispering, "You really don't have to do all this." Keanu smiled faintly. "I know, but it helps pass the time." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're something else." He handed a water bottle to an elderly man who looked uncomfortable and adjusted a pillow behind his neck. "Here," Keanu said gently. "Try to get some rest." The man blinked up at him. "Thank you, son. You've got good manners. Not many people your age do anymore." Keanu chuckled quietly. "Guess I was raised right." Greg caught himself smiling at that. He wasn't sure why, but the sound of Keanu's voice, the sincerity of it, felt like an anchor. He'd spent years surrounded by boardrooms and shallow compliments, people trying to impress each other. But this, he thought, this was something else entirely. When Keanu finally sat back down, Marissa gave him a small nod of thanks. "You've just made my night a lot easier," she said. "Happy to help," he replied, stretching slightly before settling in. The cabin lights dimmed further as the clock pushed past midnight. Most passengers were asleep now. Only the faint hum of engines and the rhythmic breathing of those on board filled the air. Greg turned slightly toward Keanu. "You really don't stop, do you?" Keanu smiled. "Not when people need a hand." Greg's gaze dropped again to his gold watch, gleaming faintly in the low light. It had once been his proudest possession, proof of everything he thought mattered. But now, it looked more like a mirror of what he'd lost. Time, meaning, balance. He loosened it from his wrist, staring at the smooth face for a long moment before setting it on his tray. "You know," he said slowly, "I bought this watch the day I closed my biggest deal. I used to think it meant I'd made it." Keanu looked at him, his expression patient and kind. "And now?" Greg gave a small, hollow laugh. "Now it just tells me how long I've been pretending." Keanu didn't reply immediately. Instead, he nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that spoke louder than any comfort could. Outside the window, a soft glow appeared at the edge of the horizon. Dawn was beginning to rise, faint but certain, a quiet reminder that no matter how dark the night seemed, light always found its way through. As the faint light of dawn touched the clouds, the cabin felt suspended in a moment of peace. The fear, the noise, the arrogance it had, all melted away into stillness. The passengers rested more deeply now, their bodies swaying gently with the rhythm of the engines. Keanu sat back, eyes open, staring out into the horizon as if he were studying the sunrise for answers. Greg leaned back too, feeling a strange lightness he hadn't felt in years. He had confessed his failures to a stranger and been met not with pity, but with understanding. That alone felt like redemption. He glanced sideways at Keanu, who was pulling a napkin from his tray. With a pen from his pocket, Keanu began to write slowly, his handwriting steady even in the slight vibration of the plane. Greg watched curiously, not wanting to intrude but unable to look away. When Keanu finished, he folded the napkin neatly and tucked it inside his book, The Art of Stillness. Greg's curiosity got the better of him. "Writing something down?" he asked. Keanu looked up, his tone casual. "Just a reminder." Greg smiled faintly. "What about?" Keanu hesitated for a moment before answering. "That kindness doesn't require attention." Greg sat in silence, the words hanging between them like a quiet truth. It wasn't a line from a movie or a speech rehearsed for an audience. It was something real, something lived. And for Greg, it hit harder than any business lecture he'd ever sat through. A few rows ahead, the young mother stirred and looked back. She saw Keanu awake and mouthed a quiet, "Thank you." He returned the gesture. With a nod, the boy still slept peacefully, one earbud resting loosely against his cheek. Marissa passed through one last time, whispering to Keanu, "We'll be descending soon. You should try to get some rest." He smiled, shaking his head. "I'm fine. You should rest more than I do." She smiled back and moved on. The plane was quiet again, and in that silence, Greg found himself thinking about what Keanu had said about peace, about kindness, about the masks people wear. He looked at his watch still lying on the tray, then quietly slipped it into his bag without putting it back on. The contrast between them was stark. One man defined by status, the other by humility. But somehow, in that shared silence above the clouds, they felt equal, two strangers who had found something real somewhere between turbulence and dawn. Keanu turned back to the window, watching the sky lighten. "Almost home," he murmured. Greg nodded softly, his voice low but certain. "Yeah, in more ways than one." The cabin had finally grown still again. The faint light of dawn spilled gently through the windows, painting the clouds in streaks of silver and pale gold. Some passengers stirred from their sleep, stretching, murmuring softly. The hardest part of the journey seemed to be over, or so they thought. A sudden change in the engine's tone broke the calm. It was subtle at first, a low hum that wavered, then steadied again. Keanu noticed immediately, his eyes lifting toward the ceiling. Years of travel had given him a quiet sensitivity to these things. He didn't panic, but he watched closely. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but edged with tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a minor hydraulic malfunction. Out of an abundance of caution, we'll be preparing for an emergency landing. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions." Gasps rippled through the cabin. A few people sat upright in shock, clutching armrests. Someone in the back whispered, "Not again." Greg froze. His hands trembled as he fumbled for his seatbelt, tightening it with shaking fingers. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. "Not this again." Keanu was already moving. He unbuckled smoothly and stood, checking the overhead bins near his row. "Marissa," he called quietly, "want me to help secure the cabin?" Marissa turned, her eyes wide but steady. "Please, we'll go row by row." Together they began walking the aisle, ensuring trays were up, bags were stowed, and passengers were buckled. Keanu's voice carried softly, reassuringly, never rising above the hum of panic. "It's okay. Just a precaution. You're safe. Keep breathing." A man near the middle section started to hyperventilate. Keanu crouched beside him. "Hey," he said calmly, making eye contact. "Look at me. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Slow and steady." The man nodded shakily, mimicking him. And after a few breaths, the trembling eased. A baby began to cry a few rows up. The young mother from earlier looked terrified. Keanu knelt again, this time beside the boy he had comforted before. The child clung to his mother's arm, eyes wide. "Hey, champ," Keanu said gently. "Remember what we talked about? How brave you were before?" The boy nodded, tears glimmering. "Sometimes even heroes get scared," Keanu said. "But you know what they do? They breathe, and they wait for the light." The child stared at him, then took a shaky breath, copying him. Keanu smiled. "There you go. That's what courage looks like." Greg watched the scene unfold, his throat tightening. The man he once mocked for being a fake Hollywood saint was now the steady heart of the plane. There was no performance in his voice, no trace of ego, just quiet, unwavering calm. Outside, the sunlight grew brighter, and the plane began its slow descent toward safety. But inside, something even greater was unfolding. A living lesson in grace under pressure. The plane dipped slightly as the descent began, pressing everyone gently into their seats. The change was subtle, but to the nervous passengers, every vibration felt like a threat. Marissa moved quickly through the aisle, tightening belts and giving calm instructions, her voice composed but tight. Keanu followed a few rows behind her, moving with quiet assurance. "Everything's going to be fine," he said to a couple gripping hands across the aisle. "The pilots are just following procedure. We'll be on the ground soon." His tone was steady, almost soothing, like a song playing softly beneath the fear. Greg sat frozen, one hand gripping his armrest and the other clutching the seat in front of him. He kept glancing toward the window, searching the endless white for any sign of the ground. The captain's earlier words replayed in his head: emergency landing. The phrase alone made his pulse race. Keanu came, by his row, his movements unhurried. "You okay?" he asked gently. Greg let out a shaky laugh. "You'd think I'd have learned by now," he said, trying to sound casual but failing. "Guess I'm not built for this." "None of us really are," Keanu said. "But you're doing fine." Greg looked up at him. "You're not even scared, are you?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Fear's natural. I just try not to let it drive." Greg exhaled, the words sinking in. A sudden jolt interrupted them. The plane shuddered, not violently, but enough to draw startled gasps. The cabin lights flickered once, then steadied. Keanu braced against a seat and turned toward the front. "Marissa?" She looked back. "We're fine," she said, her voice steady though her eyes revealed the strain. "They're leveling out pressure." Keanu nodded, then looked to the nearby passengers. "You hear that? Everything's working as it should." A few nervous smiles returned. Someone whispered a prayer. Another began crying quietly, and Keanu rested a hand on the man's shoulder. "You're safe. Keep breathing." A passenger 3 rows back pulled out a phone, discreetly recording the scene. The famous actor, helping the crew, guiding people through panic, speaking softly to strangers, as though they were old friends. No one realized that footage would later spread across the internet, becoming a symbol of quiet leadership in chaos. Greg saw the camera too, but said nothing. This wasn't for show. He could see it clearly now. Every gesture, every word, came from a place of sincerity that no spotlight could imitate. Minutes later, the captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching Los Angeles International. Our team has taken every precaution, and we expect a safe landing. Please remain seated and secured." Relief rippled through the cabin. Marissa turned toward Keanu, whispering, "Almost there." He nodded, his gaze calm but focused. "You did great," he said. She smiled. "No, you did." The plane continued its descent, the city of Los Angeles, faintly visible beneath the morning clouds. The light through the windows grew stronger as the plane descended lower, cutting through layers of soft white clouds. The faint outline of the city appeared far below, a calm reminder of solid ground waiting. The passengers began to whisper prayers of thanks, some holding hands, others simply staring out in silence. Greg could hear the captain's voice again, clear and composed. "We'll be touching down shortly. Please remain seated until the aircraft comes to a full stop." The announcement should have been routine, but after the night they'd all endured, it carried the weight of a blessing. Marissa made her final pass down the aisle, double-checking seatbelts and loose items. Keanu helped her one last time, gently securing a stroller that had shifted in the overhead bin. When she finished, she leaned against a seat for balance and exhaled. "I can't believe this flight," she said quietly. Keanu gave a calm smile. "You handled it better than most people could." She shook her head. "You mean we handled it? I don't know what we would have done without you." He waved off the compliment with his usual humility. "You would have managed. You're stronger than you think." Greg listened to every word. He'd been silent for nearly 20 minutes now, too humbled to interrupt. He kept remembering how he'd mocked Keanu at the start of the flight, how he'd laughed at the idea of humility, how he'd mistaken gentleness for weakness. Now, the same man he'd ridiculed was the one steady presence holding everyone together. The plane began to lower sharply, landing gear engaging with a distant thud. A murmur of nervous voices filled the cabin again. Keanu placed a hand on the back of Greg's seat. "Just a few more minutes," he said softly. Greg nodded, gripping the armrest, but feeling strangely calm this time. It wasn't just the reassurance. It was the belief in the voice that said it. When the wheels touched down, the cabin erupted in collective relief. Applause broke out. Hesitant at first, then growing stronger, rolling like thunder through the rows. Marissa laughed, covering her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. The captain's voice came through once more, this time lighter. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. And I'd like to give special thanks to the gentleman assisting our crew, Mr. Reeves." The applause swelled again, louder this time. Some passengers cheered. Others clapped with quiet gratitude. Greg sat frozen, his face burning with emotion. He bowed his head, unable to meet Keanu's eyes, overwhelmed by shame and respect all at once. Keanu simply nodded at the applause, his expression humble, almost shy. He gave a small wave toward Marissa, then leaned back in his seat, whispering, "Kindness doesn't require a first-class ticket." Greg heard the words, and for the first time, they didn't sound like advice. They sounded like truth. The first thing the passengers noticed after the wheels touched the ground was the rain. Thin streaks of it brushed against the windows, glittering in the early morning light. The plane slowed along the runway, tires hissing as they rolled over the wet pavement. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as the brakes engaged fully and the aircraft came to a smooth stop, the cabin erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite kind of applause travelers gave at the end of a flight. It was raw, heartfelt, and filled with relief. People clapped through tears, some laughing, others whispering prayers of gratitude. The long night was finally over. Greg exhaled deeply, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Thank God," he whispered, the words almost trembling from his lips. He had said those words before in moments of luck or business victory, but never like this. Now, they carried weight. They carried truth. Beside him, Keanu nodded, his calm smile never wavering. "We made it," he said quietly. Greg looked at him, the admiration in his eyes no longer hidden. "Yeah," he said softly, "we did." Marissa moved quickly through the aisle, helping passengers collect their things. Her composure had finally cracked. Her eyes were glistening. When she reached Keanu, she stopped, her voice shaking slightly. "You made my job easier today," she said. Keanu smiled warmly. "You did the hard part," he replied. Before she could respond, the passengers around them began to murmur. Phones appeared, their cameras flashing discreetly at first, then openly. Someone whispered, "That's really him, Keanu Reeves." Another said, "He helped calm everyone during the turbulence." Marissa laughed softly, wiping her eyes. Guess the secret's out. Keanu chuckled. It always finds a way. As the seatbelt light turned off, the passengers began standing, retrieving their bags and stretching stiff limbs. The rain outside streaked the windows like soft glass curtains. People moved slower than usual, more polite, letting others go ahead. It was as if the shared fear had dissolved every barrier between strangers. Keanu stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the others go first. Greg noticed it, how he waited, unhurried, his manner the opposite of what Greg had always associated with fame. No impatience, no entitlement, just presence. When it was finally their turn to move, Greg stood and looked down at him. "You're really something. You know that?" he said quietly. Keanu looked up. "Just doing what anyone would do." Greg shook his head. "No. Most people would have looked out for themselves. You didn't." Keanu gave a faint smile. We all needed each other tonight. That's what made the difference. As they stepped into the aisle, Marissa called out softly, "Mr. Reeves, could you wait a moment? The captain would like to speak with you." Keanu nodded. "Of course." Greg hesitated beside him, unsure if he should leave or stay. Something inside him told him to wait. He didn't want to miss whatever was coming next. The passengers began to file out slowly, one row at a time, their movements unhurried but filled with quiet awe. Outside the windows, airport lights shimmered through the light rain, painting the tarmac in ripples of reflection. Each person who passed Keanu stopped briefly to thank him. Some offered handshakes, others soft words of gratitude. A few asked for pictures, though most simply smiled, knowing they had witnessed something rare. Marissa returned from the front, her radio clipped to her uniform, her expression brighter now. "The captain asked if you'd mind staying for a moment," she said. "He wanted to thank you personally." Keanu nodded. "Of course." Greg lingered near his seat, pretending to adjust his carry-on, though he wasn't ready to leave. He watched as the aisle cleared and the flight crew gathered near the cockpit door. The moment felt heavier than the ordinary chaos of disembarking. There was reverence in the air, a kind of shared respect that everyone felt but couldn't quite express. The cockpit door opened, and the captain stepped out. His uniform was pressed, but his face carried the fatigue of a long, tense night. Still, when his eyes found Keanu, he smiled with genuine warmth. "Mr. Reeves," he said, extending his hand, "I wanted to personally thank you for what you did back there. You kept the passengers calm when it mattered most. That's not something we see every day." Keanu shook his hand firmly. "You brought us home safely," he said. "That's what matters." The captain chuckled, glancing toward the passengers who were still gathering their things. "If every celebrity acted with half your composure, flying would be a lot easier for us." The compliment drew a few quiet laughs from the crew, and even Greg smiled faintly. Someone near the front discreetly took a photo, the soft click barely audible over the hum of the engines. The captain's voice carried just enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I just want to acknowledge one of our passengers, Mr. Keanu Reeves, for assisting the crew tonight and helping keep everyone calm. We're proud to have had him aboard." Applause filled the cabin once again, spontaneous and heartfelt. The kind of applause that wasn't about fame, but gratitude. Keanu's expression didn't change. No pride, no flourish, just quiet humility. He gave a small nod toward the crew and said, "It was a team effort. Everyone helped." The simplicity of his words silenced the cabin. Even those who didn't know what to say found themselves clapping harder, as if to honor not just the man, but the message behind him. Marissa stepped closer and hugged him briefly. "I'll remember this flight forever," she whispered. Keanu smiled. "Me too." When the applause faded and the last few passengers began to leave, Greg stood rooted in place, his throat tight. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught somewhere between regret and respect. He remembered his own arrogance from hours earlier, the smug tone, the dismissive laughter. Now, that version of himself felt like a stranger. Keanu noticed him lingering and placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Take care of yourself," he said kindly. Greg finally managed to speak. "You too. he said, his voice low. And, thank you. Keanu gave a small nod and walked toward the exit, the hum of rain mixing with the faint applause still echoing behind him. Greg watched him disappear down the aisle, humbled, changed, and silent. Outside, the dawn had fully broken. The rain had eased into mist, and the world looked softer, somehow like it too had learned something about grace. The terminal buzzed with the soft chaos of morning arrivals. Luggage carts clattered across the floor, and tired travelers stretched their legs, blinking under the fluorescent lights. Outside, the rain had faded to a mist that streaked the tall airport windows. Inside, however, one corner of the terminal still carried the hum of a story that had just unfolded thousands of feet in the air. Passengers from Flight 237 gathered near the baggage carousel, still replaying what had happened. Some spoke in hushed tones, others with excited disbelief. "I can't believe that was really Keanu Reeves," a woman said, her voice filled with warmth. "He was helping the flight attendants. He even comforted my son." Another man nearby added, "You could tell it wasn't for show. The way he talked to people, it felt real." Keanu stood a few feet away, leaning casually against a pillar, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, but content. The world around him moved fast, but he remained still, like a calm center in the middle of constant motion. Passengers approached one by one, thanking him quietly, some asking for photos. He never refused, always smiling gently, always patient. Marissa and a few members of the flight crew passed by, rolling their luggage toward the staff exit. When she spotted him, she stopped and gave a small wave. "Mr. Reeves, thank you again," she said. "You made a tough night a lot easier for all of us." He smiled. "You did great work, Marissa. Get some rest." She laughed softly. "I'll try." Then, she disappeared into the crowd. The carousel hummed to life, and luggage began to slide down the metal ramp. People stepped forward to collect their bags, still glancing at Keanu as though afraid to miss their last chance to thank him. Among them, Greg stood off to the side, his bag already in hand but forgotten on the floor. He watched Keanu with a look that was a mixture of humility and shame. Every moment from the flight replayed in his head the mocking words, the arrogance, the fear, the calm hand on his shoulder. He finally took a step forward, then another, until he stood a few feet away. "Hey," he said quietly. Keanu turned, his expression open and kind. "Hey, Greg." Greg blinked, surprised he remembered his name. You remembered." "Of course," Keanu said simply. Greg swallowed hard. His voice dropped lower. "I owe you an apology. I was a jerk back there. I judged you before I even knew you." Keanu studied him for a moment, his gaze calm but direct. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "We all have bad days." Greg shook his head. "No, that's not enough. I was awful to you, and then you." He stopped, searching for words. "You handled it like it didn't even matter." Keanu smiled faintly. "Because it didn't. What matters is what we do next." Greg looked down at his shoes, then back up. "What I do next?" Keanu nodded slowly. "Just treat the next stranger kindly. That's how it spreads." The words hung in the air for a moment, soft but powerful, like an invisible ripple moving through the noise of the terminal. Greg could only nod, humbled. Greg stood there, unable to look away. The simplicity of Keanu's words struck deeper than any lecture or speech ever had. He felt his chest tighten as he nodded again, quietly repeating, "That's how it spreads." Keanu reached out and gave his shoulder a reassuring pat. "You'll be all right," he said softly. "You just have to start small." Greg let out a shaky breath, managing a faint smile. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," Keanu replied, "but it's worth it." For a moment, they both stood there in silence, surrounded by the ordinary noise of people collecting bags and greeting family members. The world was moving again, but for Greg, something inside had stopped long enough to change. He wasn't just looking at a celebrity anymore. He was looking at the kind of man he wanted to be. A group of passengers nearby approached Keanu for photos. He obliged with that same gentle warmth, crouching down for a picture with a child and shaking hands with a few others. No rush, no impatience. He didn't act like someone being recognized, he acted like someone grateful to share a moment of kindness before moving on. Greg watched, his throat tightening again. When Keanu finished, he began to walk toward the exit, the light from the wide terminal windows spilling across his face. Greg knew he couldn't let him leave without saying one more thing. "Hey, Keanu," he called out. Keanu turned, smiling. "Yeah?" Greg hesitated, his words almost catching in his throat. Then he said, "You really could have sat in first class." The corners of Keanu's mouth lifted into that quiet, knowing smile, the kind that held an entire philosophy in one simple expression. He looked at Greg and replied, "Kindness doesn't require a first-class ticket." The line hit Greg like a truth he'd always known, but never lived. Around them, the sounds of the airport seemed to fade. A few passengers who overheard smiled, whispering the words to each other, as if they'd just witnessed something sacred. The phrase lingered, echoing softly across the terminal. Greg nodded slowly, watching as Keanu turned and walked toward the glass doors leading to the waiting cars outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and cool. He stood there for a long moment, replaying everything that had happened since takeoff. The arrogance, the fear, the humility, and the lesson he hadn't known he needed. Then, with a deep breath, Greg picked up his bag and started walking not just out of the terminal, but towards something new. Behind him, a small boy tugged at his mother's hand and whispered, "Mom, that's the man from the plane." The mother smiled softly. "Yes, sweetheart, and he's the reason we all made it home." Calm. The boy thought for a moment, then said, "He's the nicest man I've ever seen." And in the quiet hum of the morning terminal, those words felt truer than anything else. The next morning, the world woke up to a story that no one on that flight would ever forget. A passenger had uploaded a short clip taken during the turbulence, a shaky but powerful recording of Keanu Reeves standing in the aisle, speaking calmly to frightened travelers, helping the crew, and kneeling beside a crying child. Within hours, the video exploded across social media. The caption was simple: "Keanu Reeves stayed calm when everyone else panicked." By noon, the video had reached millions of views. News outlets picked it up instantly. Major headlines read, "Keanu Reeves keeps passengers calm during mid-air scare." Another called it, "The flight that proved humility still exists in Hollywood." Clips replayed on morning talk shows, showing Keanu catching a falling bag and comforting the young boy. Commentators spoke about his unshakable composure, his quiet leadership, and how he refused to make the moment about himself. The internet was filled with admiration. Comments flooded every post. "He's the real deal, no acting here. Who does that on a plane? This man's heart is gold. Every time I think I can't love Keanu more, he proves me wrong." Even strangers who hadn't seen the video were talking about it. It became more than just celebrity news. It became a reminder that decency still mattered. Meanwhile, far away from the flashing headlines and viral praise, Keanu Reeves sat alone in a small diner on the corner of a quiet Los Angeles street. He wore a gray hoodie, the same worn jeans from the flight, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. In front of him sat a half-finished cup of coffee and a folded newspaper he hadn't touched. The waitress recognized him, but didn't say anything at first. When she finally spoke, it wasn't about the video. "Refill?" she asked. Keanu smiled. "Sure, thank you." She poured the coffee, hesitated, then said softly, "I saw the story this morning about the plane." He looked up, surprised. "You did? Everyone's talking about it," she said. "But what got me was how calm you were. Most people would have been screaming." Keanu chuckled quietly. "I've seen worse turbulence," he said. "And sometimes people just need someone to tell them it's going to be all right." The waitress nodded. "Well, You told the world that too, without even trying. He smiled politely and went back to his coffee. To him, it had just been another flight. But to millions of people watching from their screens, it was proof that kindness could still make headlines. Across town, Greg Whitman sat in his office, staring at the same video on his computer screen. The comments scrolled endlessly: praise, gratitude, awe. He watched the familiar moments replayed again and again. Keanu steadying the frightened passengers, helping the attendants, speaking to the boy. Greg felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't realized how powerful it looked from the outside. On the plane, it had been human. On screen, it looked almost divine. He leaned back in his chair, thinking about the man he had mocked, the one he had called fake. The memory of Keanu's calm voice returned to him. Kindness doesn't require a first-class ticket. It wasn't just a quote anymore. It was a philosophy, one that had changed him forever. Greg sat back in his chair, still staring at the video. The sound of Keanu's calm voice through the speakers carried more weight than anything he'd ever heard in a boardroom. It wasn't charisma or power, it was sincerity. And for Greg, that was something he had spent a lifetime overlooking. He closed his laptop slowly, sat in silence, and looked around his office. The shelves lined with trophies and expensive souvenirs suddenly looked meaningless. All the symbols of success that once made him proud now felt like hollow reminders of how much he had missed the point. For the first time in years, Greg didn't rush into another call or open another spreadsheet. Instead, he opened his phone and searched for a children's charity. He found one that provided emotional support for kids affected by trauma. Without hesitating, he made a generous donation in Keanu's name. When the confirmation appeared on his screen, he smiled faintly, feeling something unfamiliar. Peace. He whispered to himself, that's how it spreads. The next day, the story continued to grow. News anchors shared quotes from passengers describing Keanu's humility. Photos of him carrying blankets down the aisle circulated with captions like, "Grace in turbulence." The clip of him kneeling beside the little boy became one of the most shared videos of the week. Among the sea of comments online, one stood out. It was written by Marissa, the flight attendant who had worked alongside him that night. Her post read, "He didn't do it for attention. He did it because it's who he is." That night reminded us all that kindness still flies high. Her words spread quickly, copied and reposted across platforms. People called it the perfect summary of the story, a modern parable about decency in a world too busy for compassion. Somewhere, in that small corner diner, Keanu sat again with his coffee, unaware that the world was celebrating him. He didn't check social media or turn on the news. Instead, he read quietly from the same book he'd carried on the plane, The Art of Stillness. When the waitress came by and refilled his cup, she smiled and said, "You've been all over the news again." He laughed softly. "That happens sometimes." "What did you really say to that businessman on the plane?" she asked curiously. Keanu looked thoughtful for a moment. "I just told him what I tell myself sometimes," he said. "Be kind. It's the one thing that never crashes." The waitress smiled, shaking her head. "You're something else, Mr. Reeves." He gave a small, humble shrug. "Just human." As he returned to his coffee, the world outside the diner went on, still buzzing with his story. But inside that quiet space, Keanu Reeves remained as he had always been, steady, grounded, and unaware that his small act of humanity had become a light for millions. The evening light in Los Angeles stretched long and golden across the skyline. The city hummed below, alive with motion and sound, but inside Keanu Reeves's apartment, there was quiet. His home was modest, simple, filled with warm wood and soft light. A guitar rested in the corner, next to a stack of worn books and a single potted plant that leaned gently toward the window. He sat at his small desk near the balcony, the pages of a leather-bound journal open before him. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain, a remnant of the storm that had passed the night before. He picked up his pen and began to write slowly, thoughtfully, his handwriting steady and precise. "Fame means nothing," he wrote, "if you can't sit beside others with peace." He paused, letting the words sink into the paper. They weren't meant for anyone else, just a quiet reminder to himself. He had learned long ago that life wasn't about distance or height or applause. It was about presence and the ability to remain grounded when the world wanted to lift you above others. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the clouds in hues of rose and amber. Keanu leaned back in his chair and let his gaze drift toward the horizon. For a brief moment, he thought of the flight, the frightened faces, the trembling hands, the quiet gratitude when they landed. He remembered Greg's expression at the terminal, the man's pride dissolving into sincerity. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The building's mail carrier, an older man named Daniel, smiled through the slightly open door. "Evening, Mr. Reeves. Got something special here. Looks official." Keanu stood, walking over with his usual calm. "Thanks, Daniel. You still working this late?" Daniel laughed. "You know me, sir. These letters don't deliver themselves." "Take care of yourself," Keanu said, giving a small nod. When he returned to his desk, he placed the envelope beside his journal. The logo in the corner read, WestJet Airlines. He opened it carefully, sliding out a printed letter on company stationery. "Dear Mr. Reeves, we wish to express our gratitude for your calm leadership and kindness aboard Flight 237. Your actions helped reassure passengers and assist our crew during a challenging flight. We are deeply thankful for your example of composure and humanity. Sincerely, Captain Raymond Cole and the WestJet team." Keanu smiled softly as he read the words, but it was the smaller envelope tucked behind it that caught his attention. Inside was a handwritten note on simple white paper, the handwriting familiar but uncertain. "Keanu, you taught me that altitude doesn't determine attitude. Thank you for reminding me what real strength looks like. Greg Whitman." Keanu's smile deepened, the kind that came from somewhere beneath words. He folded the note carefully and placed it beside his book, The Art of Stillness, as though saving it as a reminder of what the world could still be. He sat back down, picked up his pen again, and wrote one final line in his journal. "Grace is quieter than fame, but it travels farther." The words lingered on the page like the final echo of a lesson learned. The night settled softly over the city, wrapping the skyline in shades of deep blue. Keanu closed his journal and placed the pen neatly beside it. The words he had written still glowed faintly under the lamp's warm light, each sentence calm and deliberate. He let out a slow breath, one that carried the weight of everything that had happened, the flight, the fear, the humility, and the quiet humanity that had followed. He turned off the lamp and stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, carrying the distant sound of traffic and laughter drifting up from the streets below. From his high vantage point, Los Angeles looked peaceful, even still. It reminded him of something he had told the young boy on the plane. Sometimes even heroes get scared, but they breathe and wait for the light. Now, standing here under the fading glow of sunset, he realized that light had come full circle. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Greg's note again, unfolding it gently. He read the words once more. "Altitude doesn't determine attitude. Thank you." He smiled quietly. It wasn't the kind of smile born from pride. It was gratitude, the kind that comes when you know something good has taken root in someone else. He folded the note again and set it beside The Art of Stillness, as if it belonged there, a part of the lesson itself. His phone buzzed softly on the table. It was a text from an unknown number. "Hey, this is Greg. Hope it's okay. I got your contact through the airline. Just wanted to say I kept my promise." I treated the next stranger kindly. Keanu stared at the message for a moment, his chest tightening with quiet joy. He typed back a simple reply. "Good. That's how it spreads." He set the phone down, feeling the corners of his eyes warm. The rain from earlier had left the air clear and clean. Far above the skyline, a single plane cut silently through the night, its lights blinking softly as it passed. He watched it go, a faint smile returning to his face. In that moment, he thought of everyone from that flight. The frightened mother, the young boy, Marissa, and the crew, and even Greg. Each of them had shared something in that cabin that couldn't be captured on a headline or in a viral video. It was something deeply human, something that no fame or fortune could ever replicate. Connection born from calm, compassion born from chaos. He sat back down at his desk and picked up The Art of Stillness. The book fell open to a page he had marked years ago. The line read, "In stillness, we find not absence, but presence." He read it slowly, nodded once, and closed the cover. Outside, the sound of the city grew softer. A piano melody drifted from a nearby apartment, gentle, unhurried, like the sound of peace, returning after turbulence. Keanu leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet music fill the room. His eyes lifted once more toward the window, where the night sky stretched endlessly, calm and open. Somewhere above those clouds, another plane was flying through steady air. He imagined the passengers asleep, unafraid, unaware of the man on the ground who had reminded the world that grace still exists, even at 30,000 feet. And in that stillness, Keanu Reeves smiled content, grounded, and at peace. The viral video had taken on a life of its own. Within days, major news outlets began reaching out to the passengers and crew from Flight 237. Everyone who had been on board that night had their own story to tell, but the one thing they all agreed on was this: Keanu Reeves had turned fear into calm, chaos into grace. The first to speak publicly was Marissa. She appeared on a morning show, still wearing her airline badge clipped to her uniform. The host leaned forward and asked the question that everyone wanted answered. What was it like to have Keanu Reeves on your flight that night? Marissa smiled warmly, shaking her head slightly, as if the memory still amazed her. Honestly, he wasn't acting. That's just who he is, she said. When the turbulence started, he didn't wait for anyone to ask for help. He was up before I could even get to the back row. No hesitation, no second thought. He just started helping people. The host nodded. You've been a flight attendant for over 10 years. Have you ever seen a passenger react like that before? Marissa laughed softly. Never. Most people panic or freeze, and that's normal. But he was different. There was this calm around him. When he looked at you, it felt like everything was going to be okay. He didn't shout. He didn't take control. He just led quietly. And somehow, everyone followed. A clip played of Keanu walking through the aisle helping passengers, his voice steady and kind. Marissa continued, her tone softening. That night changed the way I see people. Sometimes, you think heroes wear capes or uniforms. But that night, mine wore a hoodie and jeans. The interview spread quickly online. People called it the most heartfelt description yet of who Keanu really was behind the fame. A few days later, the captain of Flight 237, Raymond Cole, gave his perspective. Sitting in his crisp uniform against the backdrop of an airport hangar, he spoke with quiet respect. We had a minor hydraulic issue that required us to prepare for an emergency landing, he explained. Our crew was trained for it, of course, but when panic spreads in the cabin, even experience doesn't always calm people down. The interviewer leaned in, and that's when Keanu stepped in? The captain nodded. Yes. My first officer told me over the headset that someone was helping passengers and keeping order in the cabin. At first, I didn't realize who it was. Then, a few minutes later, we patched a brief message through the intercom to reassure everyone. He asked if he could say a few words. The interviewer raised an eyebrow. He spoke to the passengers himself? The captain smiled. Just for a moment. But when he did, the atmosphere changed. His voice was calm, steady. He said something like, "We're all in this together. The crew's got this. Just breathe and trust the process." You could feel the difference instantly. The fear went quiet. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. When he spoke, everyone listened. The captain's words echoed across every broadcast that played the story. Viewers could almost imagine that moment, the trembling passengers, the flickering cabin lights, and then that steady voice breaking through the panic. It wasn't the voice of a movie star giving a speech. It was the voice of a man who meant what he said. Next came the passengers' accounts. A mother and her young son appeared, together on a short interview clip. The boy sat on her lap holding a small stuffed dog, his eyes wide with excitement. "He talked to me," the boy said proudly. "He told me even heroes get scared, but they breathe and wait for the light, so I did." The mother smiled, brushing her hand over her son's hair. "I've never seen someone so calm in a crisis," she said. He wasn't trying to draw attention to himself. He was just there, present. My son stopped crying because of him. And honestly, I did too. Another passenger, an elderly woman who had been sitting near the back, shared her story. "I was certain something bad was going to happen," she said. "Then I looked up and saw him helping the crew, moving through the aisle so calmly. It was like he carried peace with him." "I don't know how else to explain it," the interviewer asked softly. "Did you know who he was at the time?" The woman chuckled. "Not right away. I don't keep up with movies much. But later, when everyone started whispering, I realized. And I thought to myself, well, that makes sense. Only someone used to saving the world could stay that calm." The clips rolled one after another, each more heartfelt than the last. Every person described the same thing in different words: how fear had turned into stillness, how a stranger had reminded them to breathe. Finally, Greg Whitman appeared on camera. His once polished confidence was replaced by quiet humility. He sat in his office, but his posture was different now, less rigid, more human. "I was sitting right next to him," he said. "At first, I thought he was just another celebrity, trying to look humble. I made jokes about it. I even mocked him. And then, the turbulence hit." He paused, taking a slow breath. "I panicked, completely. But he didn't. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me to breathe. I didn't realize it then, but that moment, it broke something in me. The arrogance. The mask. He didn't just calm the plane, he grounded my ego," the interviewer asked gently. "Did you ever speak to him after?" Greg nodded. "Yeah. I apologized. And you know what he said? 'You don't owe me anything. Just treat the next stranger kindly.'" He smiled faintly, his voice thick with emotion. That line has followed me ever since. The interview ended with a soft montage. Marissa's laughter, the captain's admiration, the boy's shy smile, Greg's reflection. Over it all, the narrator's voice summarized what everyone already felt. He wasn't acting. He wasn't performing. He was simply being himself, a man whose humility spoke louder than fame. The screen faded to a shot of the same airplane gliding peacefully through the morning sky, sunlight spilling across its wings. For a world constantly looking up to stars, it was a reminder that sometimes the brightest ones walk quietly among us at 30,000 feet, carrying peace in their hearts. The week that followed the flight turned into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. What began as a short, shaky video posted online had grown into a worldwide conversation about humility, kindness, and true leadership. Major news networks replayed the footage alongside interviews from passengers, experts, and psychologists who analyzed the power of composure in moments of fear. On morning talk shows, hosts described the event not as celebrity gossip but as a modern-day parable. One headline read, "Keanu Reeves teaches the world that kindness still flies high." Another called him the calm in the cabin. But even as the world discussed his quiet heroism, Keanu himself remained invisible to it all. While others analyzed his behavior, he went on with his days as if nothing had happened. He rode the subway, walked to his favorite coffee shop, and smiled at strangers the same way he always had. When asked for interviews, he politely declined, telling one reporter, "It was just another flight. Anyone could have done the same." But not everyone agreed with that sentiment. In classrooms around the country, teachers used the story as an example of grace under pressure. Videos of Keanu helping passengers were played to students as lessons in empathy and calm leadership. "This," one teacher told her students, "is what true strength looks like. Not power, not pride, but peace." In workplaces, managers shared the story during leadership training sessions. Airlines began referencing the event in case studies on emotional intelligence, teaching new flight attendants how one person's demeanor could shift the mood of an entire cabin. The story became a symbol of the difference one individual could make by choosing kindness over fear. Even faith leaders spoke about it from their pulpits, pointing to Keanu's response as a reminder that humility has more power than pride. The moment transcended fame. It had become something spiritual, something human. Greg watched it all unfold from a different vantage point. His company had always been known for competition and ruthless ambition traits that mirrored the man he used to be. But after that flight, something inside him had shifted permanently. At his next board meeting, he stood before his employees and spoke quietly but firmly. "I met someone recently who showed me what leadership really looks like," he said. "It's not about control or status. It's about calm. It's about care. It's about remembering that kindness doesn't require a first-class ticket." The room fell silent. From that day forward, Greg launched a new initiative within his company: mandatory empathy and respect training for all staff, from executives to interns. He even changed one of the company's guiding principles to read: "Lead with humility, listen with heart." His employees noticed the difference immediately. Meetings became more thoughtful, communication more sincere. Greg often referenced Keanu's words during discussions, reminding his team that every person, regardless of position, deserved to be treated with dignity. When a reporter later asked Greg what had inspired the transformation, he smiled and replied, "A stranger on a plane who reminded me what humanity really looks like." The story didn't just inspire corporate policies or classroom lessons, it began to ripple through ordinary lives. People around the world started sharing their own stories of kindness. Strangers helping one another on trains, neighbors checking on elderly residents, passengers comforting others during turbulence. The phrase, "kindness doesn't require a first-class ticket," became a quiet mantra repeated across social media, a simple truth in a noisy world. Across continents, the ripple continued to grow. A teacher in Chicago wrote an essay about the story for her students, asking them to describe a time when they saw quiet courage in real life. A pilot in Canada shared a post about how one calm passenger could make an entire crew stronger. In airports, travelers began greeting flight attendants with more warmth, often mentioning that viral flight. Even months later, the story refused to fade. People didn't just remember it, they lived by it. Social media filled with posts tagged, "Number kindness flies high," each one a small reminder that goodness still traveled faster than any plane. There were photos of passengers helping strangers with luggage, people giving up their seats, and handwritten notes left for flight crews saying, "Thanks for keeping us safe." For Greg, the change ran deeper than hashtags. His life had slowed down in ways he hadn't known he needed. He started walking to work instead of taking his car. He began listening to his employees instead of commanding them. And on weekends, he volunteered at a children's community center, the same organization he donated to in Keanu's name. He never told anyone about the flight, at least not in detail. When people asked what changed him, he would just smile and say, "A lesson at 30,000 feet." Meanwhile, Keanu remained detached from the spotlight the story created. When friends mentioned the global attention, he laughed quietly and said, "It'll pass." He didn't read the articles or watch the interviews. To him, it was never about what people saw, it was about what they felt. One evening, he sat across from an old friend at a small cafe in Los Angeles. The friend pulled out his phone and said, "You've seen the latest headline, right? They're calling it the kindness effect. Schools, offices, even airlines are using your story as a case study." Keanu smiled, stirring his coffee. "It was just another flight," he said gently. "Anyone could have done the same." His friend looked at him for a moment, shaking his head. "That's why it mattered. Because you never thought you were special." Keanu didn't respond. Right away, he glanced out the window, watching planes lift into the sky above the glowing city. Their wings caught the sunset, streaking light across the horizon. After a moment, he said softly, "Then I hope it reminded people of something simple. That decency doesn't need attention. And kindness doesn't wait for applause. His friend nodded. You reminded the world what real leadership looks like. Keanu smiled, looking back toward the rising plains. Leadership, he said quietly. No, just being human. The camera of the world had long moved on to other stories, but the echo of that flight remained whispered in airports, retold in classrooms, remembered by those who had been there. And somewhere above the clouds, another plane carried strangers together, each of them unknowingly touched by the same lesson. Kindness, like flight, was still in motion. A few quiet weeks passed. The world had begun to move on, as it always did. The headlines that once carried Keanu's name now spoke of new stories, new moments. But for those whose lives had been touched by that flight, the memory still lingered like a calm light in the distance. One afternoon, Keanu returned home to find a small envelope among his mail. There was no return address, only his name written neatly in blue ink. The handwriting looked familiar, careful, rounded, and warm. He tore it open gently and unfolded a single sheet of paper. It was from Marissa, the flight attendant. The first line made him smile. I hope this finds you well, Mr. Reeves. Or should I just say Keanu, since I doubt you'd ever insist on titles? He read on. That day changed how I see my job. I've been a flight attendant for 12 years, and I always thought my purpose was to serve to make sure people were fed, safe, and comfortable. But I realized something. Because of you, our real job isn't just safety, it's steadiness. You reminded me that calm can save more lives than panic ever could. Her words continued softly. When the turbulence started, I was scared. I tried to stay professional, but inside, I was shaking. Then I saw you helping people, moving with that quiet confidence. And suddenly I remembered why I do this. Not to control fear, but to carry peace when others can't. You reminded me that kindness travels faster than fear. Keanu paused there, his thumb brushing over the edge of the paper. He could almost hear her voice again, gentle and sincere, as if she were standing beside him in that aisle. He continued reading. I wanted to thank you again for helping us that night, but more than that, for showing everyone what real grace looks like. People like you remind me that it's not the uniform, or the fame, or the rank that gives someone value. It's the heart. And yours is the kind that makes people breathe easier just by being near. Marissa's letter ended simply. Wherever you fly next, may the sky be gentle, and may your calm keep inspiring others, even those you'll never meet. With gratitude, Marissa. Keanu folded the letter carefully, as if it were made of glass. For a moment, he didn't move. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft lines of light across his desk. He reached for his journal, the same one he had written in the night he returned from the flight, and tucked Marissa's letter inside the back cover. He sat quietly for a long time, gazing out at the golden skyline. Then, softly, he spoke to himself, his voice low and thoughtful. We all share the same sky, he murmured, no matter the seat we're in. Keanu stayed by the window, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the sky met the Pacific. Planes traced soft white lines high above, silent messengers crossing between worlds. He thought about the passengers on those flights, the business travelers, the parents, the dreamers, the tired souls chasing home, all of them sharing the same fragile trust in the air. The letter had touched something deep inside him. It wasn't pride he felt, but gratitude. Gratitude that one simple act of calm had reminded someone else of their purpose, of their strength. He had never thought of himself as someone who inspired others. He had only ever wanted to meet life with gentleness. He reached for his journal and flipped through its pages. Between the reflections, the quotes, and the scribbles, one page stood blank. He uncapped his pen and began to write slowly, his thoughts unfolding like quiet waves. True peace, he wrote, isn't about control. It's about surrender. The world shakes, and we shake with it, but we can still choose what we give to others. A smile, a steady word, a hand in the dark. That's what holds things together. He paused, looking at the words. Then he smiled faintly and closed the book. That weekend, he boarded another flight. No entourage, no special treatment, no cameras waiting. Just Keanu with his backpack, a paperback novel, and that same quiet presence that followed him wherever he went. He chose his seat without hesitation, economy, near the window. The flight attendants moved through the aisle greeting passengers, unaware of who he was. He smiled back, grateful for their unseen work. As the boarding continued, an elderly man struggled a few rows up, trying to lift a heavy suitcase into the overhead bin. The younger passengers around him hesitated, lost in their phones or their own distractions. Keanu rose from his seat, walked over, and gently lifted the bag into place. The old man exhaled with relief. "Thank you, son," he said. Keanu smiled. "Of course, we're all in this together." He returned to his seat, folded his hands, and watched as the sunlight poured through the cabin windows. The hum of conversation blended with the soft roar of the engines. To anyone looking, he was just another traveler. But to those who noticed, there was something unmistakably grounding about him, a stillness that seemed to calm even the air around him. As the plane ascended, he rested his head against the window, the soft clouds glowing beneath the morning sunday. In the reflection of the glass, he saw his own faint smile and thought of Marissa's words. Calm can save more lives than panic. He closed his eyes and whispered quietly, "And kindness, that's what keeps us flying." The view outside shifted to endless blue. The world below grew smaller, but somehow more connected. It was a sky he had shared with thousands, strangers, friends, and those who would never know his name. And yet, in that shared silence, he felt united with them all. The camera of imagination would fade then to the soft image of the man by the window, calm and content. A small streak of light crossed the sky behind him, painting a golden path through the clouds. In that quiet moment, there was no fame, no first class, no distance. Just a reminder that true class isn't a seat, but a state of heart. And high above the world, as the engines carried him forward, Keanu Reeves smiled, once more a man at peace beneath the same sky he had taught others to trust. A full year had passed since the night that changed so many lives. The world had moved forward, as it always does. But for the people who had been on Flight 237, that evening had left a quiet mark that never faded. The city was alive that night with lights and music. Inside a grand ballroom in downtown Los Angeles, hundreds of guests filled the hall for an annual charity gala dedicated to children's welfare programs. It was the kind of event filled with polished speeches and glittering dresses. Yet beneath the glamour, something more genuine lingered in the air, a shared sense of compassion. Greg Whitman stood near the entrance, dressed in a simple dark suit. Gone was the boastful swagger he once carried. His expression was calm, his smile easy, and his posture relaxed. For those who knew him from his earlier corporate days, the difference was remarkable. Over the past year, Greg had transformed his company into a place that valued empathy as much as profit. His leadership training seminars had been renamed Kindness in Motion, inspired by the lesson that had changed him 30,000 feet above the ground. He often told his team, "Leadership isn't about altitude, it's about attitude." Now, as he moved through the gala, he greeted guests with genuine warmth. When he saw a group of young volunteers helping set up the silent auction table, he stopped to thank them personally. One of them looked surprised. "Most donors just walk by," she said. Greg smiled. "Then let's start a better trend." He moved on, pausing near the refreshment table, when he heard a familiar laugh, light, musical, unmistakable. Turning, he saw Marissa standing near the stage, talking with one of the event organizers. She wore a navy blue evening dress and the same warm smile he remembered from that flight. He walked over, feeling an unexpected rush of nostalgia. "Marissa?" She turned, her face lighting up. "Greg, I can't believe it's you." They hugged warmly, laughing at the sheer coincidence. "You look great," she said. "How's life treating you?" "Better than I deserve," he replied honestly. "I heard you got promoted." Marissa nodded proudly. Head flight attendant now. I train new hires. That night changed everything for me. I realized calm isn't just part of the job, it's the foundation. Greg smiled, touched. You're still carrying that lesson. So are you, apparently, she said, gesturing to the event around them. This gala, I heard you're one of the sponsors? Only one of many, Greg said. But yeah, it felt right. I started focusing more on causes that bring people together instead of just chasing numbers. Before they could continue, a journalist approached, microphone in hand, with a photographer trailing behind. Mr. Whitman, may I ask a quick question? Greg nodded politely. Of course. The journalist smiled. You've undergone quite a transformation this year. Many people have noticed the shift in your company's culture, the focus on empathy, integrity, and kindness. What inspired it? Greg thought for a moment, then smiled softly. A man in economy taught me what first class really means. The room around them quieted just enough for a few nearby guests to hear the words. Some smiled, some nodded knowingly. It was clear that even without saying his name, everyone knew who he meant. The journalist smiled, clearly intrigued. That's quite a statement, she said. Would you mind explaining what you mean by that? Greg's expression softened, his tone humble. I met someone who showed me that class isn't about comfort or money. It's about grace, humility, and how you treat the people beside you no matter where you're seated. He paused, his gaze wandering briefly toward the entrance of the ballroom. I used to think success meant being at the top, but that night on a plane, I learned that real success is staying grounded while you rise. The journalist lowered her microphone slowly, her face thoughtful. That's beautiful, she said. Greg smiled and nodded. It's true. The conversation ended, and the journalist moved on to the next guest. Marissa looked at Greg, shaking her head with a fond smile. You know, she said, if he were here tonight, he'd probably laugh at all this attention. Greg chuckled. Yeah, he'd probably say it was just another flight. They both laughed, knowing exactly who they were talking about. Across the room, unnoticed by most, a tall man in a simple black suit stood near the back corner of the ballroom. He kept his head low, watching quietly as the event unfolded. The golden light shimmered across the faces of donors, families, and volunteers. At the check-in table, his name didn't appear on the guest list, but a small envelope had been handed to the organizer earlier that evening, an anonymous donation. The note inside read simply, "For the children, with gratitude for the kindness that keeps us all flying." It was signed with only an initial, K. Keanu Reeves lingered for a few minutes longer, his hands in his pockets, content to stay invisible. When the live band began to play and the room grew louder, he smiled softly, then turned toward the exit. He slipped out quietly, unnoticed by the cameras or reporters who might have turned his presence into another story. Outside, the city lights shimmered across wet pavement. The rain had just stopped, leaving the air cool and clean. As he walked down the quiet street, a small voice called out behind him, "Hey, you're him." He turned to see a young boy standing with his mother under the glow of a street lamp. The boy's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're the man from the plane, the one who helped everyone." Keanu smiled gently, waving, "Hi there." The boy grinned and waved back enthusiastically. "You're the nicest person ever." Keanu chuckled softly. "That's kind of you to say. Be nice too, okay?" The boy nodded eagerly. "I will." Keanu raised a hand in farewell, then continued walking. The mother smiled as she watched him disappear into the night, his quiet figure blending with the rhythm of the city. The streetlight flickered once, casting a soft glow over the puddles where his reflection lingered for just a moment before fading. The eternal traveler of kindness was gone again, not seeking recognition, only peace. Somewhere above, another plane crossed the dark sky, its steady lights tracing a path toward dawn. And beneath that same sky, Keanu Reeves walked on, carrying the same lesson that had changed the world. True class isn't measured by the seat you're in, but by the heart you carry wherever you go. The morning light streamed softly through the half-drawn curtains of Keanu's quiet Los Angeles apartment. The world outside was beginning to stir, the distant hum of cars. The faint call of gulls carried inland from the coast. Inside, the air felt still, calm, centered. On his wooden desk sat a small journal, the same one he had carried during that flight a year ago. Its pages were filled with quiet thoughts, reminders, lessons, and the names of people who had touched his life along the way. He sat down with a cup of black coffee, the steam curling gently upward. For a long moment, he simply stared out the window, watching a plane glide soundlessly across the pale morning sky. The sight brought a faint smile to his lips. There was something endlessly humbling about watching those tiny silver wings cut through the endless blue. Each plane carried a mix of lives and stories, each passenger unaware of the quiet miracles happening in the seats beside them. He opened his journal to the final blank page and began to write in his steady, thoughtful handwriting. "Planes remind me that we're all heading somewhere together," he wrote. "Different destinations, different dreams, but one sky. Titles, seats, fame, they fade at 30,000 feet. What lasts is how we treat one another. Kindness steadies turbulence. Grace softens fear. And humility, even in the smallest seat, has a way of lifting everyone higher." He paused, reading the words aloud softly, letting them settle. Then he continued. "Maybe that's what life is, a long flight, through moments of calm and chaos. We can't control the weather, but we can choose who we become in the storm." Keanu closed the journal slowly, resting his hand on the cover. The simple weight of the book felt grounding. Around him, the light grew stronger, pouring across the desk, reflecting off the edge of the coffee cup. He thought about Greg and Marissa, about the child who had waved at him in the street, about all the strangers who had written letters of gratitude after that story spread. But what touched him most wasn't the praise, it was the quiet ripple effect of kindness. How one calm action had led to another, how fear had been replaced by compassion, arrogance by reflection. He rose and set the journal on a small shelf beside a stack of well-worn books. One of them was The Art of Stillness, its pages slightly bent at the corners from years of travel. He touched its spine gently, as though thanking it for reminding him of the beauty in silence. Outside, the sky began to glow gold. A plane passed overhead again, its engines low and distant. Keanu stepped onto his balcony, letting the breeze wash over him. The air smelled faintly of rain and morning coffee shops down the street. He closed his eyes, breathing it in, content. The city stretched far beneath him, a web of motion and stories. Somewhere, someone was rushing to catch a flight. Another was coming home, and perhaps someone else was learning. At that very moment, that kindness was the only ticket that truly mattered. Keanu leaned against the balcony railing, the soft hum of the city below, mixing with the faint sound of another airplane crossing overhead. He watched it glide through the fading mist, its silver wings catching the sunlight just as it rose over the hills. There was something timeless in that image, the reminder that no matter how high one flew, every journey began with the same earth beneath. He took a slow sip of coffee, then whispered to himself, "It's all connected." The simple words carried weight. Every encounter, every gesture, every small act of humanity had a way of circling back, like the steady paths of those planes across the sky. It wasn't fame or fortune that tied people together. It was empathy. It was the courage to stay kind when the world seemed to lose its calm. Inside, the light deepened, washing the room in golden warmth. The open journal on the desk caught a sliver of that light, illuminating his final entry like a quiet truth meant to be seen. "Planes remind me that we're all heading somewhere together," it read. "Titles, seats, fame, they fade at 30,000 feet. What lasts is how we treat one another." He left the journal open on the desk and stepped back. The words would stay behind, silent, but enduring a message to anyone who might someday read them. The scene slowly shifted to a wide cinematic view of clouds parting above a glowing sunrise. The sky opened in a vast expanse of light, gentle and endless, mirroring the feeling of peace that followed every storm. The narrator's voice, calm and steady, carried through the image. If you believe kindness still flies higher than pride, the voice said, then let this story remind you that grace needs no luxury and compassion knows no class. The sunlight grew brighter, turning the clouds into a sea of gold. Hit like, share this incredible story, and subscribe for more true tales of compassion and courage. The narrator continued, because sometimes all it takes to change the world is one calm heart at 30,000 feet. The music swelled gently, piano and strings, full of warmth and hope. The final shot lingered on the plane, gliding effortlessly through the morning sky, a soft trail of vapor glowing in the rising light. Then, as the music faded, two lines appeared against the sky, inviting reflection. Have you ever met someone humble who changed your perspective? The words hovered for a moment before the next appeared. What's one act of kindness you'll never forget? The screen held on the sunlight breaking through the clouds, the kind of light that follows every storm as the music faded into silence. Somewhere far below, the world went on. People boarding flights, strangers sitting side by side, stories waiting to unfold. And up there, among the clouds, the lesson remained: kindness doesn't need a first-class ticket. It just needs a willing heart.